Hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We'll go ahead and get started right now. I just wanted to say welcome first off to the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative webinar and also happy National Crawfish Day. It just happens to be a perfect day to talk about crawfish or crayfish or crawdads or mud bugs. So thanks for coming out and celebrating National Crawfish Day with us. My name is Natalia. I'm with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant and am the main facilitator of the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative, which is a program that brings together a variety of experts and stakeholders to tackle the threat of invasive crayfish in the Great Lakes region. We create monthly newsletters and highlight recent crayfish literature and news. We host webinars like this one about new crayfish research and programs. And we work and collaborate with other organizations and programs on various projects and just in general try and promote responsible crayfish practices to support and protect our native crayfish and native species. So before we begin, I wanted to quickly share some resources to help you connect with the ICC. You can check out our website, invasivecrayfish.org. Note that it's currently undergoing some construction. We're trying to update our site, so things might look a little wonky. All the content is still there and everything should be accessible, but if you notice that there are some wonky headings or footers, that's why. We'll be getting that fixed soon. If you want to join the ICC membership, you could join the link, or you can join by following the link invasivecrayfish.org/join. And then you'll be added to our Google group, which is used for rapid communication between other crayfish partners in the Great Lakes. And that's where we send monthly newsletters and share information just about anything crayfish related. And then finally, you can email me at schladuk@illinois.edu if you have any questions or feedback. And I think that Carter added all of these links to the chat. So thank you for doing that, Carter. All right. So, as most of you know, one of the goals of the ICC is to better understand how invasive crayfish spread and to support efforts that address those specific pathways. And today's webinar focuses on one of those lesser known pathways, the classroom. And so some of you may know live crayfish have been used in science education to teach concepts like ecology, anatomy, and they're also used as classroom pets to teach younger students about wildlife or about animal care. And so these classroom experiences with crayfish can be really powerful, but what happens to the crayfish afterwards? Some teachers don't know that the crayfish that they hold can have some potential impacts on their environments and they release them into the wild, unfortunately, which is something that people should never do, whether it be native or invasive. And so some of these species that teachers can hold include things like the red swamp crayfish or the westy crayfish, and they're also really common in biological supply kits provided to teachers for science lessons, and then eventually get released into nearby water bodies. So to share more about this important pathway, we're excited to welcome Izzy Paulsen. She will share her mixed method study exploring how and why teachers use live crayfish, as well as how outreach can play a supporting role for teachers. So Izzy is a master's student right now in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University. She's a social science researcher currently studying invasive species introduction pathways. And prior to being at Purdue, Izzy studied anthropology and environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she has also worked in conservation, science communication, and environmental education, and is passionate about helping people connect with the world around them. So thanks so much for being here, Izzy. We're really excited to hear more about your work. Now, for those of us that are attendees and joining us today for the webinar, you can type any questions that you have in the Q&A box or in the chat at any point during Izzy's presentation. And then after Izzy presents, we'll have a discussion together and she'll have a chance to answer your questions then. And also as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the ICC website and on YouTube with captions. Okay, that's all I had. Izzy, you can go ahead and share your screen and the floor is all yours. And let's see, it's We currently see the presentation, not in presentation view though. Oh,
What's
there we go. It works now. Might have just been slow on my end.
Yeah, it's very slow on my end as well, but we're looking good.
Yes, all is good.
Okay, amazing. Thank you for that introduction, Natalia. I am really excited to be here. Happy National Crawfish Day, everybody. I'm happy to be able to celebrate this day with you all because I don't think I would have been doing a whole ton otherwise. But I wanted to present on my ongoing research right now, which is on crayfish use in the classroom. So, as Natalia mentioned, this is a part of my master's research, so it's one part of it. And I'll be finishing that up in July, so we're getting near the end. But I'm highlighting here the ways that teachers use crayfish in their classrooms and the whys, so that we can better understand what teachers are doing, and how they're doing it. So Natalia has definitely queued me up a little bit for this. But yeah, live crayfish are used in classrooms across the country for a variety of reasons. They really help to teach a lot of different scientific topics and concepts, but also just provide that stimulation and engagement. It's been proven a lot that live animals are really beneficial to kids' social, behavioral, and academic development, and crayfish are definitely showing those benefits. So they are a great animal that teachers have in the classroom. And two of the ways that they are commonly obtained are either collecting them from the wild, like directly from a stream or a nearby water body, whether it's from the teacher themselves or it's somebody they know or they go out with kids and use it. So that is one big way. And then the other common method is those biological supply companies, who will send crayfish kits and curriculum all across the country. Sometimes, depending on the state's regulations, they are going to be sending native species, but sometimes they don't have necessarily those regulations in each state, so it's not as clear. Um, and then the two common methods of disposal that have been noted in several studies from like Michigan and Missouri, are that they are kept as a classroom pet after they're done being used for their lessons, or they're released to the wild. And sometimes that is from, when they've collected them from the wild. So they collect and then they return where they, got them from. But that is not always the case, and that's part of where this potential invasive species pathway comes into play, too, is like if they are not collected from the wild or if they are not returned exactly where they were collected, that can help the spread of these species. And then, as Natalia mentioned, two of the common species used are red swamp crayfish and rusty crayfish. And I will just very briefly go over those because they're the two main ones, and I think everybody in the audience probably has an idea of these two invasive crayfish. But red swamp crayfish are native to the southeastern part of the United States, and in the Great Lakes region, they're really only native to a very tiny part of Illinois. Um, but they are one of the most widely introduced species worldwide and have been moved around through bait, aquarium, and aquaculture ventures primarily. And then rusty crayfish is the other species that is very common and invasive in the Great Lakes. It's native to parts of Indiana and Ohio, but has really had a big range expansion through like different waterways and human translocations. And they're very adaptable and able to survive in that wide range of habitats. Uh, Going into my research specifically, the goal of it has been just to understand the ways that teachers use live crayfish in their classrooms and their motivations for doing so. This hopes to help prevent future invasive crayfish introductions in the Great Lakes. But I do want to say, like, we are looking at just any kind of crayfish use, not just invasive crayfishes. So we don't really, in no part of this study have we asked a teacher directly, like, if they're using an invasive species or not. Just because I don't think that that would have been harder to evaluate. So this is just general crayfish use. But by better understanding how they're used and why, we're really hoping that it highlights invasive species introduction prevention to help protect our ecosystems. Then also that it emphasizes the need for responsible and humane treatment of these animals after they're done being used in the classroom, both for, the animal, but also for the potential consequences that might happen from it. And a big goal of this research, and that's been guiding it, has been to help inform outreach professionals like people with the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative, so that as they work with teachers and try to provide resources and encourage safer behaviors, they have a better understanding of what is exactly happening and why it's happening, so that they can better communicate and work with teachers on that end. This research has been guided by the situated expectancy value theory of motivation. And so, theory in social science work is really important, and it helps to guide and underpin a lot of the work and interpretations that we're able to do. It can help us interpret what we find, but also theory helps to provide also instruments for making sure that we're measuring the specific constructs and the ideas that we're hoping to get. And so the SCVT, situated expectancy value theory, was developed first in around the late 80s, early 90s for student achievement. And so it was looking at how students are able to find motivation and how that affects their achievement levels. It's been widely adapted from that to a bunch of different disciplines like communications, economics, and just general education beyond teachers. Um, and so the whole motivation for me using it is that it is suggesting that an individual's personal choices, performances, and individual motivations are directly influenced by their beliefs of how well they will do a task, which is that expectancy construct, and their values around it. So the value construct. Um, and it really emphasizes that these beliefs and values strongly influence um, are are influenced by specific situations that somebody is in. And so the main parts of this that I'm using for my research are looking at those those constructs, and they're shown through a few different things that we look at. One is self-efficacy, which is a person's belief in their ability to accomplish a goal or a task. So that kind of looks like how confident are you in your ability to do X or Y or Z. And then we're looking at their intrinsic interest in it. So that's the anticipated enjoyment one gets, one expects to gain at least from doing the task. Then we're looking at utility values. So how well that task fits into their present and future plans. So an example of that in, education might be, helping their kids solve problems is a way that it could be a utility value. Attainment value is looking at those personal and identity-based importance that they have attached to it. So, again, in education, an example would be enhancing their curriculum, something like that. So it's attached to that identity of being a teacher and that professional aspect. And then the last part of this theory that we are using is the perceived costs. So that's the potential effort needed or opportunities lost that they might go through for doing a task. Um, so something that detracts from what they would be hoping to do or takes that extra effort, and everything like that. The research questions that are guiding this research are going to be what were the ways that teachers were acquiring, using, and disposing of live crayfish for the use in the classes. The next one is how and to what extent do teachers value the incorporation of live crayfish? And so that's using those values that I just mentioned. And so just like looking at what those values are. And then the third one is to what extent can a teachers' task value beliefs predict their interest in professional development for incorporating live animals or environmental concepts. And so that's really looking at can we connect those values that a teacher has to their interest in outreach and wanting to learn more or engage more within live animal use, crayfish, environmental concepts. And so this is a mixed method study that I'll be highlighting. And in social science, mixed method studies have two parts to them. They have qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative in the study will be using interviews. And the big benefit of qualitative work is that it can provide really rich descriptions and context for what's happening. So you get a lot more depth through it. And quantitative, such as like an email survey, which I'll be highlighting next, is going to help provide that more generalizable data and some of those numbers so that we can better understand broadly what is happening. For this work, I did both qualitative and quantitative work, and I did them concurrently. So I had both studies, both parts of the study going on at the same time. I started with qualitative interviews, and towards the end also put out my survey, but I didn't stop interviewing until after the survey was closed. And so for my methods of getting these interviews, we talked to teachers from all 8 Great Lakes states, which I'm really happy that we were able to have that breadth, that geographic breadth. And they ranged from elementary to high school teachers. We recruited our participants through professional networks, including like the Center for Great Lakes Literacy, which is a Sea Grant program, and then also Sea Grant educators and connecting with their contacts. So that was a really great opportunity to talk to these people. And then we reached out through science teachers associations with different states. And finally, gathered interest from the survey part of it, which I'll be talking about, where they had a chance to indicate interest in speaking with us more and going into depth. And so for our interviews, we offered a $40 incentive for talking with us. And each interview was conducted with a interview guide, and it lasted between 20 and 45 minutes. Each interview, well, the interview guide and each interview was semi-structured. So that means that we had a predetermined set of questions that helped to guide the conversation, but had the flexibility built into it to probe and follow up with additional questions based off of our interviewees' responses and go into detail, and different things. And then each interview was recorded and the audio files were transcribed verbatim and used for qualitative coding. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about qualitative coding here, is that is the process of assigning labels or codes to segments of qualitative data, like interview transcripts, or it might be documents. But then with these codes and labels, you organize them and identify patterns and themes within what's being talked about and within the data. So then this helps researchers to really systematically analyze it in a rigorous and transparent way but then be able to tell a story with what's happening and have that kind of narrative from what all of these interviews are. And so for those codes, there's a few different methods to go about it, but what I had was I had a predetermined list of codes that were really theory informed and informed from other research because I was asking things that we really wanted to learn. So I started with those and then coded a bit and got a team together of three other people, and we all then used a code book that I created to code independently three interviews. Each person coded the same interviews and looked at the different places where we all agreed on what was coded and where we might have disagreed. So really looked at where those disagreements were and talked about them and got to a place where we all agreed and were comfortable with the definitions and what would have been coded. And so this process really helps researchers then be able to make sure that they're being consistent. And so it takes away some of that bias that might be there of one person only coding it. There's statistical analysis that goes with it to evaluate like how aligned the codes were, and our numbers that we got were well within the range of acceptable. So we know that we were pretty consistent with our coding, and then I went through and have been coding the rest of them. Some of the interview questions that we asked were really around the themes of live animal use, then those how and whys of crayfish use, and finally following up with the training. And so here I have just listed a few of the questions that we were asking. So, what kinds of animals have you used and how have you used them? Why did you decide to use live crayfish? How is that helpful to enhancing student learning? And what kind of preparation for teachers would help you incorporate environmental concepts? So, those are just a few of those interview questions. In the quantitative survey aspect of it, we sent a survey to a randomized sample of 10,000 teachers who taught science in Great Lakes states. The reason why we do a randomized sample is so that we can hopefully get generalizable information. And so that way we can hope to make conclusions Great Lakes states wide, depending on the amount of people who respond and some of those things. But that's why we do that randomized sample. We did it in a stratified way. So we sent out 1,250 emails to teachers per state. So it was just each state got 1,250 teachers randomly selected. For two states, Minnesota and Illinois, we were able to get information for the licensed science teachers and from the Department of Education of each state. So we were able to just randomly sample them. And then for the other six states, we were not able to get that information. And so we purchased that from a educational list serve company. And we just purchased the 1,250 per state directly from them. So we didn't randomize that sample, but it came to us randomized. The survey had two parts to it. The first part was asking about just general teaching experience, like how long have you been a teacher, or do you teach in like a public school, private school, things like that, and then live animal use. And so this part helped us to see who qualified. It had those questions of, do you use live animals? And then if so, what animals? And they had the opportunity to check out of a list of 13 that we had, any that they had used in their classes. For the teachers who had clicked crayfish from that, they were then asked to go on to complete the full survey. And that had those questions around motivations and crayfish use and outreach and was a lot more in depth. So those teachers who completed it had a chance to win a $25 gift card as an incentive. And some of the questions that they were asked and answering were things directly related to those motivation constructs. And each one was on a scale of 1 to 6, with 1 being strongly disagree to 6 being strongly agree. And so that would be like, I'm interested in incorporating crayfish into my classroom so that I can learn new things. And then they'd rate that on a scale. Each value that I'd mentioned, so like that utility value or attainment value, all of those had multiple questions asked about it. So for each of them, there were about 3 to 6 questions that were asked on that scale, and then we averaged them out and tested them to make sure that they were all the answers were all aligned and very consistent so that we are making sure that uh we were getting the same information and that it was a reliable question to understand that variable. And for all of the variables we had, we were also getting really good consistency at high values. It's called alpha coefficient. So we had high levels of the alpha coefficient. So we were very consistent with that, which is great for our analysis. Going into our results, this is the fun stuff. For our interviews, we talked to a total of 19 teachers. So far, we've transcribed and coded 15 of these interviews. So that's what we're seeing here. So this is very preliminary stuff and still is going to be adjusted and changed. But I wanted to give you a look at what the code book that I'm working with is. So we have a list of, I think it's about 28 codes here, of what we were seeing consistently through different interviews directed from different questions that we had. And the way that it works is that we have our code, and then I add a short like definition or inclusion criteria and different quotes that highlighted that. And then on the right-hand column of these, you can see how many interviews they were talked about in. So, for example, collaboration with organizations had 5 different interviews where people talked about it. And an example quote is that this teacher was working with a graduate student, and she said that the graduate student would be out there and we would be out there together, setting the traps on certain days, pulling them out, doing measurements. And so, like, the kid's data is actually going to go into her published work, which is really cool for them to see. And so that's one example of a quote from uh, how some teachers are collaborating with different organizations to really do their work. Another really fun quote I wanted to highlight here, so under the student assistance code, each interview so far that we gone through has mentioned having students help with the care or with the handling and teaching of these crayfish. And so one teacher was highlighting the benefits of making relationships with kids. And so she said, I think if you incorporate kids, let's say after school, if you got a kid, even if you got a kid for disciplinary reasons, they're paying their time, they're showing up for detention. You could kind of soften the blow, and soften the mood by developing rapport, by saying, hey, let's check out the crayfish, which could lead to them learning how to change the water. And then sometimes having a kid that's like, I'll do that once a week. So you've gained a friend for life, and you could turn something negative into something positive by giving them a job. And so these are some of the things that we were seeing and hearing throughout our interviews. And then going into just the quantitative results, so these are some of the things that we were able to see from the survey that we put out was that of those 10,000 emails we sent out, we got responses from just under 1,800 of them, so about an 18% response rate, which I was very happy with. And of those who had opened the surveys, 95% of them completed and finished the survey, which is a really great completion rate, and really happy to see so many people actually finishing and getting to the end of it. I had so many fun emails from teachers also, just because they were interested in the research and really wanting to share that. So that was very fun. And then of those almost 1,800 teachers who started uh, the survey and got to the live animal portion, 64 ended up completing the entire survey. So that is of the people who specifically used Crayfish and wanted to complete the full survey. Some of those preliminary results that we were seeing is that about half, so 48% of teachers used live animals, I should say, in their classes. And the graph on the right here highlights just like the different kinds of animals that people said that they used. And so really what sticks out to me is fish. A lot of people used fish in their classes and had aquariums. Almost every teacher that used live animals. The next most common animal used was rabbits. And the next most common category, I should say, is other. And that really is just a lot of different insects and reptiles that weren't specifically in that first list, but were very abundant. Focusing more on that crayfish, only 90 teachers who participated used crayfish at all. So, of all the teachers we got responses back from that 1,800, only about 5% said that they'd ever used crayfish in their classes. And then the other thing that we asked those who'd use live animals is where they get information about how to care for them. And I think very understandably, a lot of it was online searches. So, like 2/3 of teachers just looked it up online. But then we were also seeing that they got the information from pet stores, biological supply companies, and coworkers. And then there were a few other different ways as well, but these were the four most common. Going specifically into the 64 people who completed the entire survey, we had teachers who came from all 8 Great Lakes states as well, again, so that was great. The majority of them had a master's degree or higher. They taught primarily at public schools, and they ranged from rural to urban areas of where they taught. And they also had about 5 to 30 plus years of experience, and that average was about 21 years, is what it noted. So we had a lot of really well-seasoned teachers who were responding. And then they noted that they used crayfish in grades 3 through 12. So a really wide range of grades and teachers who are using these animals. Going into how they were used, the most common way that they're used is for scientific observation. It really provided a great opportunity for that inquiry-based learning and for helping them teach about how to run experiments. In the interviews, one teacher she was describing how she has her third graders run experiments. So they learn how to ask a scientific question, how to collect data, and like how to ask a question that they can collect data on, which is really interesting because usually it's just tally marks, but it's really setting that foundation for how to run a scientific experiment and how to think critically about these things. And then how to like make graphs and charts and come to conclusions about it. So crayfish have that really great ability to have observation abilities. And then the second most common one was they were there as a classroom pet. which provided a lot of different kinds of learning opportunities, both for the other things that are mentioned in this graph here, but when they were a classroom pet, we were also hearing how they were incorporated into different kinds of different kinds of subjects. So one teacher, he was describing how they wrote essays from the perspective of crayfish in his fifth grade class. He didn't have the flexibility in his curriculum to incorporate the crayfish into his teaching, but like into his science lessons, but they were able to find these different ways of incorporating it into language arts. Another teacher, they were high schoolers and they did invasive species work. They had found an invasive species on their property. And so then through that ability to try to to understand what's happening in the invasive species, the kids learned how to advocate and lobby to increase the catch size limits of rusty crayfish and also to get bass for their pond, I think it was, so that they could help bring down the population even more. And so they were learning how to advocate and lobby, which I think is just such a cool experience that not a lot of students get. Transitioning into how the teachers get crayfish, just like the previous studies that have been done, it's mainly from the wild and from biological supply companies. So collecting from the wild is by far the most common, whether it's the teacher themselves, it's the students, or it's someone else who's collecting them. And then the next, yeah, common was through that curriculum and through oftentimes like their administration and districts. Then they're being disposed also by those same methods of um, just being released into the wild. So it's not very clear. I haven't been able to correlate, if it's the same people who are releasing from the wild that are getting from the wild. But overall, the numbers for that are lower than the people who got them from the wild. So, it's happening, but it's not as prevalent. Really keeping them as a classroom pet is what we're seeing as happening the most and keeping them in a tank. Some teachers in the interviews described, they then became science fair projects or they got into the aquaculture. And so they're part of like a hydroponics system, which comes with its own challenges and benefits, but they're being able to be maintained and used throughout that. And then the last thing that we are looking at in that survey is those motivation things, constructs. And so what we see here is that there's high levels of motivation for using crayfish from the teachers who do. The highest ones that we're seeing is really that self-efficacy of like teachers are pretty confident and comfortable in their ability to use crayfish, but also the questions were around invasive species and identifying native species. And so they're confident in their abilities to do that. And then also they're having really high levels of use values, and all of those personal interests and attainment values. And then they're having low costs associated with it. They're not seeing all that much having to be high cost. So for perceived costs, it was a 3, which is a slightly disagree on the scale as an average. So they don't think that there's a lot of costs associated with it. And that last one there, perceived environmental costs, that one's highlighting the perceived costs that teachers would have on the environment through their use of crayfish. And so it's really looking at, do teachers see themselves as a potential negative impact on the environment through this use? And it's really low. It's 2.9. So overall, they disagree that teachers would be having that much of an impact, or at least the teachers who were part of the survey. And so pulling all of these sources together, what we're seeing is that using crayfish in the classroom is relatively rare, but there's a lot of motivation for doing so, especially when it comes to that student engagement. And that's engaging in several ways, whether it's the lessons, connecting with the classroom environment, or just having higher attendance rates, which is a huge goal of a lot of teachers. And so some of the fun quotes here are just kids and crayfish go together. I couldn't agree more. They absolutely do. And then also, one teacher was like, I always had the highest attendance rate at my elementary building. They knew if they missed something, if they weren't there that day, they were going to miss something. So like the students, if they weren't in class, they were going to miss something that had such an impact and really a connection to students throughout. And then it's that low level of costs for the use. So one teacher is like, they are extremely low maintenance as far as comparing to other animals go. Sometimes they needed to make sure that they had have food, but the teacher was describing how the students were more picky than the crayfish because the students wanted big, fat, juicy earthworms. And thankfully, they had a connection with the bait shop and got worms donated, but there's another teacher who's like, yeah, the top recess activity is to go collect worms for the crayfish. So the students are really loving that, which also helps to have lower costs because those students are helping in that process. The other big conclusion is that a lot of teachers are aware and talking about invasive species. They consider it when they acquire them, how they care for them, and how they dispose of them. So, of the 15 teachers we have interviewed and coded so far, 12 of them mentioned invasive species pathways in some way without any prompting. I did not ask them a single question about environmental impact or invasive species and they were independently bringing it up, whether it was crayfish related or other animals, but they were really engaging with these concepts at a variety of ways. In the survey, 6% of those respondents explicitly mentioned that they used crayfish to teach about invasive species. So it's on their mind. One of my favorite quotes I'm going to read out is that invasive species is one of those things that is a major environmental issue, which is awful, but at the same time is the most educational, hands-on experience that the kids can actually get. So I get excited about that. And I completely understand that. I say that all the time too, of just like, oh, invasive species is they're so great. And I'm like, not great in the sense that I don't like them being there, but they're a great way to communicate and to really connect with people and get them those hands-on environmental experiences. And then another quote was, that's how we got involved with rusty crayfish because the kids were like, what the heck does the native crayfish look like? And we're like, well, we have no idea because we'd never got one before. So they're able to really talk about these environmental problems through crayfish, which is very interesting. And then pulling into that last research question, which is that outreach interest. So teachers had high levels of interest in receiving outreach materials and trainings. Out of that score of 6, their average was 4.8 from what we saw. So they're interested in it. And what we were able to see is that this is correlated with teachers who had that higher level of personal interest in it, higher levels of the utility values that they saw, and then those teachers who had higher perceived environmental costs, so saw that there might be an impact more, all were more interested in receiving outreach, and those things were connected. And so that's what the graphs on the right there look at is just as you get higher, they're just linear regression. So as you get higher values of those value interests, you can see higher interest for outreach and those trainings and materials. And then just quickly, some of those methods of outreach that were highlighted during the interviews included conference workshops, trainings, especially where teachers had time to share experiences and talk to each other. That came up a lot of communicating with other teachers, working with local professionals, so extension, conservation, DNR, all of those things were mentioned by teachers. reaching out to school districts and working with those science teams on the district level was something that a lot of teachers also advocated for, especially if they didn't have that flexibility in their curriculum. Like if it was just a classroom pet, that's a great way to work with teachers and to get these lessons into the curriculums, is what they were saying. And then another suggestion was to have care guides with common mistakes made or set up, because there's a whole ton of different challenges that came with teachers using live crayfish. They were described as scallywags or as being particularly excited to escape from aquariums and everything like that. So those are just some of the things that were highlighted through the interviews and ways that teachers really wanted to be engaged with and have the opportunities to learn and think others would benefit from as well. So I know just about out of time for this. We're about to move into the Q&A. I just want to say thank you to Stuart, my advisor, Katie, Natalia, and Greg for their guidance at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. Ava Hale has been working with me. She's an undergraduate assistant in the lab with that data analysis and that transcription. And then thank you to the funders, including Invasive Crayfish Collaborative. So thank you. I am now happy to do questions and everything like that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Izzy. That was a really informative presentation. And I got a lot from that, really, even for my job too. It's really interesting to see how many teachers talk about invasive species. Like you said, the 12 out of the 15 educators just brought up invasive species without being prompted. So that's amazing. So now we're going to open it up to the participants. If you guys have any questions, you can type them up in the chat or in the Q&A box. Currently, we don't have any questions right now, but I have a couple for you that I'd like to ask while our attendees are typing in their questions. Did you see any regional differences in how teachers use crayfish and think about invasive species? Just because, you hit every single Great Lakes state, and I know that each Great Lakes state has, their own crayfish regulations. And so I was wondering if that ever came up in any of your interviews or your surveys.
Yeah, I did not see any big regional differences of statewide ones. I think that it's hard because some states we got like for interviews we had one person from Pennsylvania, so you can't make general conclusions with that, but I wasn't seeing really any differences between states in any of that or in the data analysis. The biggest kinds of differences or regional differences I saw were coming from urban versus rural or that suburban versus rural, and especially around how teachers taught about like if a crayfish died or taught about euthanasia. So some teachers in rural areas were like, yeah, crayfish die. We like kids don't really become very concerned about that because that's just a part of the way it is. Whereas I was talking to, some teachers from more urban and suburban areas, and they were like, yeah, the crayfish, we'd have funerals for them. We'd really go through that emotional learning process. Because like the crayfish had names and were really associated with them. So there were like differences on that end of like how to talk about death and some teachers not being equipped, which also comes up with when we were talking about disposal with like euthanasia. Like some teachers were like, I don't know how I'd communicate that to my students. So that's one of the differences that we were seeing through the interviews, at least.
Yeah, that could be a pretty tough topic, especially for younger students. So that makes complete sense. Thank you for that answer. Okay, so we have one in the Q&A chat. This person asks, it's great to see the interviews and surveys have interest in invasive species, but could there be a bias that the teachers interested in these topics were the ones who chose to take the survey/interview?
Absolutely. That is something that we have as a limitation of this study, especially when it came to the interviews, because we were already contacting people who had been interested and engaged in it, like through Sea Grant, of they're likely more aware. So yeah, I think bias is definitely a part of some of that, but even within that, seeing still so many teachers that are aware of invasive species, I think is heartening. And in the survey, the only potential that they would have had to talk about invasive species or mention it is they had like a text box to put all the different ways that they used crayfish. And so it was those participants who specifically put invasive species that we counted. Um, and so, yeah, it's hard to say exactly. We can't generalize how many teachers know about invasive species. Like the 12 out of 15 cannot be generalized to the rest of the teachers using it, but there's enough out there that are considering it, I think, to be heartened.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat. Do you know how many teachers knew what species they had? Did they try to ID the crayfish?
Yeah, so in the interviews, a lot of teachers, I think, who were working with invasive species had an idea of the ID. We didn't specifically ask for that, but a lot of them were able to identify at least native versus invasive species, is what they were saying, especially the ones who went out to the water bodies to use it. And then the other thing I wanted to mention with that is that there was at least one teacher who said it was her personal goal in the next year to learn more about invasive species, well, more about crayfish ID specifically. So there's also that interest of like wanting to learn more about crayfish ID. And they'd go to a lot of different resources they mentioned, like especially DNR page and extension pages were the top resources for learning more about crayfish.
Great. And then we've got quite a long one from Eric. I'll read this, and if Eric, you want to specify or go in more in depth, go for it. So he says, on the West Coast, high crayfish use in elementary school classrooms was driven by a popular curriculum, for example, FOSS or Full Option Science System from the University of California that was used by many schools, over 60% in Washington State. Where schools in the Midwest are using crayfish, did you find any evidence of shared curricula or programs that use crayfish? In the Midwest, it seems like the use of crayfish is a little more bottom up from the teachers themselves rather than a top-down curriculum that school districts have committed to.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we saw both. We saw both that bottom up of it's the teacher's passion, they're the ones creating this curriculum. And we also saw teachers who use it was FOSS and I think BOCE were the main ones used and directly mentioned by teachers. And so they were using those curriculum kits. And often had them, bought by their districts. I think overall in the interviews, it happened more often that it was teachers creating their own curriculum, but we did have some of them. And I'd also say that I think it was BOCE very much communicated well with their teachers about invasive species and like if they were able to release animals. So there was one teacher in Michigan and she was talking about how they worked with the curriculum company and they were like, this is a native species. You can release this. If you don't want to, you can send it back. But this one is completely okay. And so, like, they had that communication going in with their teachers.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really good question and great
Yeah.
answer. Um, so last question. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat. But I had another one, just because obviously this is a passion of mine as well. So you said that the main use of live crayfish in classrooms is for scientific observation based off your data and helping students understand that scientific process and create hypotheses and so on and so forth. Um, Kind of thinking about this more generally now, do you think that live animals in general should still be used in classrooms, given the, from your data, the relatively low number of teachers who released their live animals into the wild? Do you think there are maybe any other better alternatives? What are the stakes of using live crayfish and just live animals in general?
Yeah, no, this is something that's definitely I've been thinking about a lot throughout this research. And I think that a lot of what the teachers were saying is that it's really an avenue to connect students with the outdoors. Increasingly, like those veteran teachers were saying, students just aren't interested as much in the live animals or in you know, like getting outside and everything. And so by having them in the classroom, they're able to help introduce them in ways. And so it really feels like it's a great way to engage students to have some of those learning benefits, including lessons, but I think it's those social and engagement benefits that are really harder to struggle with, and to get those higher attendance rates, that provide a really great benefit for having animals in the classroom. I never had any growing up, but I know people who did, and those are the kinds of things that kind of stick with them and to create those stories. And I think engaging students and helping to build that environmental stewardship is just so important that when we're doing it in a very ethical and considerate way, it's a great opportunity. But it has to be combined with that, like making sure we're not releasing and not introducing anything through that. So it's kind of hard, but I think it still has really great benefits.
Yeah, thank you. We did get another question in the
Oh,
chat
yeah.
actually, so we're just going to keep going until the very end. Did you hear if teachers trust the biological supply companies to know that they are not sending invasive species?
Yeah, we did not hear much about how teachers trusted the biological supply companies, aside from, well, we heard that the ones who mentioned invasive species trusted the supply companies because they were communicating about that, but those were also the teachers who either were able to release or some of them were like, they're sending invasive, like they sent red swamp, so we just knew not to release, like, or they were really communicating strongly, like these cannot be like the curriculum companies were like, these cannot be released. Do not release them, kind of thing. Send them back. So it seemed like they had that higher communication and so those higher levels of trust, but we didn't hear specifically about trust with the curriculum company.
Great, thank you. Seeing no other questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, I think that we will wrap it up. That's all the time also that we have for today. So thank you again, Izzy, so much for sharing your time and sharing your work with us today. And if anyone has any follow-up questions regarding today's talk, could they reach out to you? Could you type in
Absolutely.
your
Yes, I will put my email in the chat.
perfect? Thank you so much. Awesome. And thanks everyone for being so engaging and for joining us today. Yeah, so thanks again. Have a good National Crawfish Day. Really think about the native species and protecting them. All right, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.